Thank you for listening to Offline and Unfiltered. We are your hosts, Lakeisha and Megan.
On this podcast, we bring you unfiltered conversations on business and culture through listener stories, expert interviews, and a little bit of shit talking. All right, and we are live. We're very excited to welcome Alice onto the show today. Alice is an expert in the trust and safety space. Lakeisha and I have been having conversations about the different responsibilities employers have to protect their employees. We always talk about, from toxic people and employee relations and all those other difficulties that happen in the workplace. But how does it work when the product can expose you to toxic people or dangerous situations, or even just situations that the average person doesn't encounter in their day-to-day? So we have invited Alice onto the show today to talk a little bit about what that work looks like and to ask her some questions on trust and safety as a whole career, the future of trust and safety, and just have some interesting conversations along the way. So Alice, welcome to the show. Would love to have you start us off with just an introduction on yourself and tell our listeners a little bit more about what you do.
Hi, thanks for having me on your show. I really appreciate it. Let's see. I'm Alice Hunsberger. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently on a break between jobs, taking the holiday season off to recover and refresh myself before jumping into the world of trust and safety again. Although clearly not doing a super great job at doing that because I'm talking about trust and safety now when I'm supposed to be taking a break from it. But previously, I was at Grindr. I was VP of customer experience there for 3.5 years. And customer experience included trust and safety, content moderation, moderation policy, customer support, and user insights, voice of the customer. And then prior to Grindr, I was at another dating app, OkCupid. I was there for 10 years, started as employee number 20 or so as a frontline content moderator, and then was their first customer support hire, built the customer support team from the ground up, managed the support team and the trust and safety team, wrote the policy, basically had the same position that I had at Grindr. So that's been my professional career in tech and trust and safety. But prior to that, I also founded and moderated an online forum 21 years ago now, before social media existed, before people really knew what trust and safety was. I was figuring out how to have people be nice to each other on the internet, how to set rules, how to set boundaries, how to enforce those rules. Got kind of a crash course in it just as a hobby when I was 19 and had no idea what I was doing. So I've been working in and adjacent to the field of trust and safety for a long time. And then, trust and safety generally is the field of work where you keep bad content off the internet. That's sort of content moderation in a nutshell. All the awful things that people do or say to each other have to be reviewed. There has to be policies and rules. And then there's a proactive element to it as well, which is often called integrity work as opposed to trust and safety. And that's making sure that the social media platforms or other internet platforms are set up in a way that are healthy, positive, good for your user base, and hopefully preventing some of those trust and safety issues to begin with. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, such a fascinating career, and it's something I think most of us take for granted, right, when we're operating on different forms of social media, dating apps, things of that nature. I would love to just hear you kind of walk us through how it works. So I'm on LinkedIn, someone posts something like graphic or I just don't want to see, and I hit that little report button. What how does it kind of work from the back end for the average person? Like, does that go to a human immediately? Is there some kind of AI interface typically that jumps in there? If you could walk us through that, I think that'd be really interesting.
Sure. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of LinkedIn specifically or, really any platform other than the ones that I've worked for. Typically, platforms don't really advertise the exact under the hood mechanisms because that then introduces a bunch of information to bad actors who might take advantage of it later. So you never really know when you hit that button if it goes to a human first or if it goes through an AI or machine learning model first. Most of the time, it'll probably go through some kind of machine learning model to check against policies. And then if it's a borderline case or if it's something that gets flagged that does need human review, then it'll go to a human review team. And then often, but not always, those teams are outsourced, like contractors, not employees of the company themselves. So there are these companies that provide the labor to do that frontline content moderation work. And then there's always escalation flows. So if something is a gray area, really hard to make a decision, it'll get escalated up and eventually get to an internal person or a manager or something else. So depending on the platform, depending on the piece of content, depending on how common the issue is, depends on how it's worked through. I will say there's a act in Europe that passed that is just going into effect. It went into effect first I'll say it's the Digital Services Act. It went into effect for very large online platforms over the summer. It's going into effect for smaller platforms in February. And that is going to require platforms for users in Europe for illegal content only to tell you whether AI or a human looked at your report and to tell you the result of that report. So we might start seeing more transparency for users because of this legislation, but generally it's sort of a black box where you don't know exactly what's going on after you hit the button. You can just guess.
Oh, that's so fascinating. And yeah, that law in Europe is really interesting because I know that there's been a lot of conversations about AI and like there's both the people who think it's going to ruin the world. There are the people who think it's like our savior. And I know, Alice, you and I had a really interesting conversation about how AI and kind of feeds into moderation, that there's always calls to do more. But at the same time, it seems like there has to be a human element. And I would just love to hear your perspective on that, of how you kind of strike that balance between what a computer can do and what a human can do, and like why we're not at a place where a computer can just do all of it.
That is a very complicated question. Please stop me if I go on for too long. I think there's a couple things at play here. So one is thinking about the people who actually have to look at the content that gets reported. There's sometimes really traumatizing content that a human has to look at. For example, child sexual abuse material has to be verified by a person, just because the consequences of reporting an image to NCMEC or other law enforcement, if it's not actually verified, the consequences could be pretty high for the person who posted it. So that always gets reviewed by a person. But then there's other things that are also terrible and awful that no person should have to look at. And ideally, you can use technology to minimize the trauma and minimize the trauma so that moderators don't have to look at it quite as much. So that's like one benefit of it. The downside, of course, is that humans are really messy and complicated. And the things that people do are numerous. And so for any particular rule or any particular, reporting reason that you can possibly imagine, there's going to be somebody who tries to get just up to the line so that they don't get into trouble, but no more. Or there's going to be somebody who breaks a rule in some like weird new creative way. And those are things that machine learning algorithms have a hard time with. There's always going to be something unique that a person has to weigh in on. So generally ML is good for the really, really bad cases that are pretty clear cut, or the more mild cases that happen over and over and over and over and over again, and that are pretty easy to spot and automate because the volume is so high. So bots, for example, or certain kinds of hate speech. However, all that said, using machine learning algorithms for something broad like hate speech can also be problematic, especially for marginalized communities. So people can use reclaimed language. They can have their own phrases or words that other communities wouldn't know of. And those are things that, maybe 99.8% of the user base uses word one way, and the 0.2% uses it a completely different way. Well, obviously the algorithms are going to be tuned for the majority, not the minority, and that can result in some communities being over moderated and having a worse experience on the platform. So again, it's always a trade-off. There's lots of trade-offs. Somebody, Charlotte, who is head of the Trust and Safety Professional Association, she always says that trust and safety really stands for trade-offs and sadness, which I think is very appropriate.
Alice, you bring up, a really good point when you talk about kind of people who are actually scrubbing this content and the impact on them. So I would say maybe 6 months ago, I was listening to NPR and they had a guest on there who was talking about Facebook and, their content scrubbers and how, that work could lead to PTSD. And so I'm just wondering, what kind of, support or parameters are put into place to ensure the trust and safety employees are safe doing their work to protect the masses?
That's a really good question. There's some science being done now on exactly what the best practices are for content moderators. So we have some information about what best practices are, but it's not really a field that's been studied too in depth. So we're learning more and more every day. Trust and safety is a field that has been around as long as the internet has been around, but also has only really been recognized professionally in the last couple of years. So I can give you a few ideas, but I'm sure they're not really comprehensive. So firstly, access to mental health services is the most important thing. So making sure that everybody has really good health insurance, that mental health is included in that. I think pretty much any BPO, any outsourcing company that has hundreds or thousands of content moderators working for them will have in-house psychologists there and available to people whenever they need them. So that part's really, really important. Also having, workshops and seminars and information on resiliency and best practices so that you're not just being reactionary when something bad happens, but you're also helping to teach people how they can protect themselves and their mental health ahead of time. And then the other part that I think is generally a little less well developed in the industry is giving people a sense of autonomy and choice over the work that they do. Often content moderators are pretty low paid. The work they do is fairly rote. And they're not given a lot of autonomy or choice about the types of work that they do. They just have a queue and they work their way through the queue until the end of their shift. And just working in that kind of queue-based environment can be really stressful. So, if you add traumatizing content on top of that, then you're kind of doubly stressed. And so giving people ample time, breaks, the ability to go take a walk around the block if they see something really difficult, giving people opportunities to further their knowledge or education, to do research projects, to opt in or out of certain types of content that they don't feel comfortable with or that they feel really passionate about. Those are all things that can be really helpful as well.
Yeah, all of that is so fascinating. And I think one of the interesting points you bring up, especially for business leaders that might be listening and maybe thinking to yourself like, oh, we should probably invest in this, is I think you've dropped a lot of really good nuggets of like what to look for in a partner, right? And it's like making sure that they have a model of, hopefully they pay competitively within the market they're in. Hopefully they have those mental health resources that, you were just talking about, and can be that partner in a space where it can get sticky, and you would never want your product, like Lakeisha was saying, it's like there's studies now that these people might end up suffering from PTSD. So, really making sure that they have the support and resources to both protect your community, but then also protect the person, moderating that content.
Yeah, exactly.
I am curious, like, from your perspective and like your own journey, like you and I discussed this, like you've seen the worst of the worst, right? Why do you do this work? And how did you get to a place where you're still doing it, in the sense that now you're, not only are you doing this work, you're in charge of big teams, right? You're ascended to the highest levels of trust and safety. Like, what keeps you going and doing work like this?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I fell into it. So, like I said in my intro, when I was a teenager in college, I learned what content moderation was and why it was needed. And I actually had a terrible experience. I was bullied and harassed, and, it was awful. I was like, I'm never doing this again. I'm never being in charge of moderation, because when you try to ban people, they get really mean and nasty. And I just didn't want to deal with it. And then, when I was at OkCupid, I realized that I'm actually really good at it. And I'm good at distilling people's problems into like nuggets of truth or insights that could be helpful for a company. And I like to feel as though I'm helping people. I like going to work every day where I feel like I'm making a difference in people's lives and doing things that make their experience safer or better. And I think I realized that I have probably, extraordinarily high natural resilience. So I'm able to do this kind of work where a lot of people aren't. And maybe that makes me feel somewhat obligated. So I don't know. And now at this point, I'm just like a nerd about it, like I've been doing it for so long and it changes so fast. Every day there's some kind of new thing. So right now it's AI, but there's been lots of other developments and things over the years. And so it never gets boring. It never gets old. There's always a new challenge. There's always something to figure out. and I find it fascinating. So it's kind of a good combination of natural ability and having randomly fallen into it and continuing to be interested in it even all this time later.
You know, Alice, I heard you kind of share a theme in the beginning. You mentioned kind of taking some time to do some self-care, pour back into yourself. And I heard you share in that you also have a high level of resiliency, right? And so I'm just curious, you know, for our listeners who may also be in this space of trust and safety, what are some practical tips you can give them to ensure that they can continue this work? Because it's very important.
I think for me, the thing that has been most helpful, I have a bit of a leg up on. So I was raised as a Buddhist. Both my parents are Buddhists. And so I grew up learning how to meditate and knowing what mindfulness was. And I haven't always had a regular meditation practice, but there's been periods of my life where I get back into it a lot, and then, you know, periods where it's a little bit less. But through meditation, you learn to recognize that the thoughts that you have aren't you. Like, you are not your thoughts. Your thoughts can drift off. You can let go of them. You don't need to ruminate on them and hold on to them like they're facts. And that the practice of meditation literally teaches your brain how to let go of those thoughts. And so when you come across traumatizing material, having that trained brain that knows how to let go of things really quickly is really, really helpful. So that's probably like my number one thing is, if you don't meditate, that could be really helpful, because it teaches you to be able to let go and move on. And that's really important. I think the other thing is being able to compartmentalize a little bit at the end of the day. I'm really bad at this one, actually. So I will give this tip, but it's not necessarily one that I always follow. But if you can just like close your computer at the end of the day, don't look at it, don't think about it on the weekend, go do something else, then you can come back refreshed the next day. And, you know, again, it's sort of letting the difficult content that you work with be in its own time and place and not seep into every other aspect of your life. And then the third thing I touched on a little bit when I talked about what good tips are for content moderators is, you know, this idea of autonomy and letting people choose what they want to work on. A lot of the people who I know who have been working in trust and safety for a really long time have certain things that they feel especially passionate about. And that gives them a sense of purpose and mission. So obviously you want to keep everybody safe and keep all of the different bad things from happening. But often there's like one or two things that people really care about, have a special personal relationship with, and helping to move those things forward can be really empowering and helpful, and can kind of help you feel like there's concrete good that you're doing, not only for the individuals that you might work for, but also for society as a whole, or the tech industry as a whole, or your fellow trust and safety people. So I don't know, those are some of the things that help me.
Yeah, those are great tips. I think a lot of those tips can just apply to any job. Like I was, when you made the comment about like compartmentalizing, I was like, oh yeah, I'm really bad at that too.
I am too.
Same. When she said close the laptop and turn it off, I was like, what a concept.
Yeah. I have to tell my teams always, whenever I hire a new person and start working with them, I'm like, do as I say, not as I do. Like, don't check Slack at night. Don't work on your vacation. Take lots of time off. Like, I'm so bad at doing those things. And so I always tell people, don't follow me as an example. Like, you will, if you do what I do, you could burn yourself out. For me, for some reason, often I like to have a sense of control. And I think being very on top of everything that's going on and having all the information about everything immediately gives me this false sense of control. And so that's why I check email and Slack and everything else at all hours, because it makes me less stressed out than if I just don't look for 12 hours and don't know what's happening. And that's part of why I'm trying to take a really long, like 6-week break between jobs so that I actually do untrain myself from doing that a little bit, and so that I can step back and have enough of a break so that when I go into my next job and invariably like don't follow this advice again, at least I will have had a little bit of a break. So hopefully that works. We'll see.
I would say I share that same sentiment. It gives me peace knowing, right? And I wouldn't say necessarily the control component, but you saying that made me think maybe there is an element of control to that. But just knowing that, okay, everything's kind of on track, or if there is a fire, I'm aware of it. One thing, Alice, I would like to pivot a little bit and just lean into, hearing about trust and safety in your work and even the subset of integrity in there. I'm just curious, how does your role interface with the various work streams within an organization, including HR, including the operations side, and, how does that fold into trust and safety amongst the employees in the workspace?
Well, I'd love to hear Megan's perspective on this too, as an HR person who I worked with before. But but from my side, I mean, one of the great joys of customer experience work and, trust and safety is how cross-functional it is, truly. So I have been able to work with every single department in organizations, from finance to HR to legal, engineering, product, security, like everybody in one way or another. And, that's because when you have a platform that has user-generated content and users are interacting with that content, often that is the center of the product. My sort of point of view personally is that in many cases, certainly with dating apps, which has been, where I've worked for the last 14 years, the people, the users on the platform are the product. Like, people on dating apps are there to meet other people. And so it sounds callous to say that they are the product, but you could have all the buttons and the interface and all the other things that the engineers build, but without the humans who are creating those profiles and talking to each other and uploading photos and needing moderation, you don't have anything. And so how you treat those people, how you look at the content that they create, the rules and norms that you set, that you require your users to follow, that sets the tone of the company as a whole. People often think of companies as, what their interactions with moderation have been like. So you can look at X, formerly Twitter, today as maybe a pretty famous example of somewhere where content moderation norms have changed really quickly and people notice, and the user base has changed pretty dramatically based on these content moderation decisions. So all of that kind of feeds back into not only the experience that the users have of the platform, but also the experience that employees have of the platform. So I've had lots of conversations with HR around both recruiting and retention. And so you can think about what are the messages of like, we treat our users well, we have really good values, our, guidelines are talking about things that matter, things that employees are going to be super psyched to work on or think about. That's really good for recruiting. And then for retention, giving people that direct mission of doing good and helping people and reducing bias and increasing positive experiences. Like those are all things that people want to feel like they're part of. And so having that human element and really building the mission of helping your users, helping other humans into the framework of a company, I think can make a really big difference for everybody.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that again. As someone who worked with Alice, I think one of the things, Alice, I think because of your like high EQ and your whole team's high EQ and just like being in the people space in like a different frame, like your team was like huge culture carriers, cared a lot about the mission, cared a lot about how we treated each other. And I think you and I had partnered on like resources you brought forward for your team were just great resources for employees in general around these sort of things, like setting boundaries for yourself, taking care of your mental health, like taking a break, flexible work schedules, things like that. And in that space, I always saw your team as like great partners, great guinea pigs for new projects, things like that, because of just the mission orientation, the high EQ, and just like the general engagement. And I will say, as someone who knows that you and your team saw some of the worst of the worst, always like upbeat, always happy. So I think it is sort of a situation where that when that work calls to people, it is like very fulfilling. And not to say that there aren't bad days, but it is really interesting how your team in particular, like you were just saying, it really is a big piece of the whole organization and a big anchor point. Like every team, kind of interfaces with your team in some way. And I think it's always like a great team to look to on like, this is how we keep our users happy, is how we keep our employees happy. So just doubling down on a lot of you said. I loved working with you, Alice.
Yeah, it was good. I think too, just based on what you just said, it's funny. I don't think I ever thought about it this way, but trust and safety and HR people are natural allies because not all of the work that our teams do, but a lot of the work that our teams do are like sorting through interpersonal problems between different people. Mm-hmm. And HR does that internally. Yep. And we, trust and safety does that externally. But there's a lot in common there for sure. I don't know that you guys are, you're maybe the trust and safety of the internal company. So we're doing the same work.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your comment in the very beginning, there's a lot of gray. Like trust and safety, moderation is not black and white, just like every kind of interpersonal issue within an organization is not black and white. Like there's very rarely this person is definitely in the wrong and this person's definitely in the right? There's some situations there is, and our ban button is, here's your severance package, right? But, yeah. Or no severance package at all, depending on how bad it is. But it does like require you to really kind of take a step back and like sort through all the different scenarios and all the different possibilities. And like, just like, I don't think like, there's lots of people is like HR is a job that'll go away with AI. And I'm like, I don't think so, because you do need someone to come in and like see the gray and talk about the gray. And like at the end of the day, make a decision that usually nobody's happy with.
Right. I think, Alice, you hit on something that's so key about HR and trust and safety really being allies. And, hearing Megan talk about what you cultivated in your former position, really being a culture champion and, being really, I guess, progressive in some of your models for your team. And so I see that in HR as well. A lot of our decisions are based on the mission of the company, policies, like how does this behavior align with our organization, and what does it mean to allow someone to act in this manner in the workspace. And so it's interesting to really see that they're really parallel, the work, HR and trust and safety. And I'm really amazed too about the work you're doing. I think it's great work. One thing I did want to just kind of go back to, just for our listeners, I know we're all familiar with BPO, but can you just share with our listeners what BPO is so everyone knows?
Yeah, they're otherwise known as an outsourcing company. BPO literally stands for business process outsourcing, which, is kind of a silly phrase that I don't think is super relevant to anything. But when you think about BPOs, typically it's customer support teams, now content moderation teams. But BPOs will do all sorts of outsourcing work. Sometimes, like, I don't know, accounting can be outsourced, or programming, engineering, pretty much anything you can think of. If you need some people in a pinch, there might be a BPO that does it.
How would someone know, or how can someone figure out if this space is the right space for them, Alice? Like, maybe someone's listened to this conversation and thinking, like, maybe that's like a space I want to go into.
That's a really good question. I hear about this a lot. There's, been a lot about trust and safety in the news over the last few years. And so now people are thinking about trust and safety as a possible career path. I think if you're considering doing trust and safety work, one really good way to figure out if you have the resilience for it is to volunteer for a crisis helpline. It's advice that I give everybody. A, you're doing good work volunteering somewhere, and B, you will deal with some really difficult situations and hear some really sad stories, and it will give you a sense of what it might be like working with that stuff full time. So that's one thing that I think is just practical. If you're only thinking about it theoretically, get some actual hands-on experience working with this kind of content. There's also ways that you can volunteer, moderate. So Wikipedia, Reddit, Discord, they all have these kind of crowdsourced volunteer moderator models. And so you can do some moderation that way as well and get a sense. And then, I think the biggest challenge, perhaps, for a lot of people who are interested in trust and safety is they're, idealist do-gooders. That's why we are all drawn to this kind of work to begin with, because we want to help people. But you have to have a realistic viewpoint that often trust and safety needs to be practical. The work has to be affordable for the company. It has to be reasonably balanced between what's good for moderators, what's good for users, what's good for the business, what makes sense financially, what has to be done legally, the, age-old debate between freedom of speech and expression and safety or censorship. Where's the line? There's compromises constantly, and you have to be comfortable with good enough or a step in the right direction, or starting somewhere and proving out a case before you're able to do the next thing. And so if you're the sort of person who really needs their work to be defined, to have a beginning, have an end, know what success is, reach success, feel comfortable in that, it's probably not the right field for you. There's a lot of work with nuance, not only with specific decisions that need to be made, but also, negotiations around the business once you get to the executive level. So it's work in the gray area and working with traumatizing content. And if both of those sound really fun and exciting to you, then welcome to the club.
What are some things you're looking forward to in the future of trust and safety? Like, what gets you excited about staying in this space and seeing this space grow?
That's a really good question. I think that there's the thing that I'm most excited about right now is like the professionalization of the space. It's becoming more defined generally as an industry. There's industry associations now. There's groups of peers who can share best practices. There's a conference that's only been around for a couple of years. And so many of us are sharing with each other in the industry in ways that we haven't yet before. And there's an increasing amount of academic research, industry research, that's being done in the space, both for moderator wellness, but also what kinds of user interventions work. So it really feels like a brand new field in many ways, even though I've been doing this for over 20 years. So I think that's what's most exciting to me, is kind of continuing to learn and grow and feel like it's accelerating. And then everything with generative AI is certainly going to change the space. Probably not this year or next year, but in the next handful of years, 2-3 years, I think we'll see generative AI and regulation hand in hand together transform what trust and safety looks like for a lot of companies and for a lot of users. And so, constant, quick changes and improvements, I think, keeps things fresh.
Alice, you mentioned a conference where a lot of the trust and safety leaders are getting together. I'm wondering if you could share that conference for our listeners, if they're interested in getting in this space or if they're currently in this space and wanting to network.
Yeah, of course. So there's two main ones. There's the conference that the Trust and Safety Professional Association puts on. It's called TrustCon. And then there's another conference that is a little bit more focused. It's for people who work in like two-sided or marketplaces especially, but any kind of platform where users are buying and selling things. That's called Marketplace Risk. And that's also really trust and safety oriented. So they're both really good.
Well, Alice, thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation. I know I had a couple unlocks with a lot of what you said. And I even coming in knowing a little bit more about what you did, just hearing you talk about it more was really engaging and fascinating. So thanks so much for making the time. We'd love to give you the floor if folks enjoyed listening to what you had to say today. If they want to follow you or network with you, how can folks out there find you?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on here. It was a pleasure. If people want to find me, I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can do a search for my name, Alice Hunsberger. I should come up. And I also have a podcast where I talk about trust and safety. So if you like hearing me talk. Mostly I'm just interviewing other people, so it's less of me talking. But it's called Trust in Tech. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and other places where you can find podcasts. So those are the two best places to find me.
Well, Alice, I want to thank you for expanding my knowledge in this sphere of the professional sector. And so I think before we conclude, I would like to just give you an opportunity to share 3 practical things that our listeners can do to increase trust and safety, whether it be in their workplace or in a personal relationship.
That's a big question. Let's see. I think read community guidelines. If you're on a platform, nobody ever reads them, but they're really good tips to how you should interact with other people and what the norms are of a particular space. I think the other is report content that you see. Like if you see something, say something. That would work for interpersonal issues at work. You can report it to HR, but if it's on a platform, you can report it to trust and safety. Often people feel like just because at one place they didn't get an answer or they didn't get the result that they wanted, that no platform will respond. But people who work in trust and safety really, really care. And we have systems set up specifically to review bad content, and users reporting it is how we find out about it. So don't just think that somebody else will report it or will find it automatically. Please report bad stuff. And then third, I think people should hold companies accountable for the experiences that they have, and should be aware of what this sort of goes hand in hand with the first question or the first tip, which is read community guidelines. But like, if those guidelines don't include things that are important to you, let companies know. If companies aren't enforcing based on those guidelines, let them know. The more that people talk about trust and safety, and not even reactionary to the bad stuff, but like, how should we be treating each other on the internet? Like, what is a good interaction? How should we hold each other to high standards and hold companies to high standards so that we have a healthy time interacting with each other? They're really big societal questions that we haven't all figured out yet. And it's up to us, the people and the users of the internet, to kind of demand what we want to see and put our feet where it matters, and make our voices heard. So trust and safety is something that everybody can talk about and think about and should be as social media users, not just professionals like me.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important that everyone realizes the power of their own voice. I think oftentimes we are afraid to speak up and be clear and own our piece of trust and safety, because I think it's twofold, right? The organization and ourselves. So thank you for reminding our listeners about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that last note you just dropped, Alice, was super insightful. And I hope folks found this conversation as fascinating as I did. And I know I'll be listening to your podcast now going forward, because I think this is a really interesting conversation that does touch so many people in so many places. And I think it is something to think about, especially we try not to get political on this podcast, but especially given, just the height of things in the world, those sorts of things you were talking about, like how should we treat each other on the internet, are like very interesting conversations to have. So thank you again for sharing your wisdom and your time. And we really appreciate you being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. Thanks for listening to today's episode. The views expressed on this show are based on our personal opinions and should not be taken as legal advice. Contact an attorney for that.
Our theme music and sound was produced by Equilibrium. Our artwork and logo was created by Jillian Blanco. We are an independently run podcast. If you like our show, please rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to share your story or expertise, email us at stories@offlineandunfiltered.com. We can't wait to hear from you.